this evening at 5th Biennial Competition Regulation and Development Conference. Before we actually get into the inaugural session, we would like to play a short documentary showcasing the journey of CUTS from inception down until now, and about 10 minutes. So may I just request you to play the documentary, please? You could carry your tea or coffee inside, and please move to the front chairs, those who are sitting at the back if there is space.
Democracy without economic freedom means little to the masses. It can best be promoted through a rights-based approach. This is the core philosophy of consumer unity and trust society. CUTS began in 1983 with a unique wall newspaper, Gram Gadar, which means Village Revolution. It was an attempt to fill the information gap with a focus on the rural poor of Rajasthan. The plight of the poor in accessing basic necessities like food, medicines and power was the driving force behind the establishment of CUTS. Work was started out of a motor garage with a zero budget. In those days of socialism, the quality of most goods and services was poor and was accompanied by shortages. For instance, the number of matchsticks per box was much less than the declared quantity of 50. Matchsticks being a mass commodity like salt, consumers would feel the impact of being fleeced of several million rupees annually. This scenario improved after CUTS took legal action. Using a law to assert consumer rights is often more effective than advocacy. CUTS public interest litigation on female sterilization victims is an example. It led to a change in the government's policy of targeting women as numbers. Helping persuade the government to pass the Consumer Protection Act in India was one of CUTS' most successful efforts of the early 80s. This led to the realization that promoting economic democracy is a vital part of political democracy. It also brought about the realization that business has to behave with consumers and that the state has to ensure a balance between the consumers and the producers' interests. In 1990, CUTS campaigned for the poor and, with the blessings of Mother Teresa, marked 1st November as World Poverty Day. Soon after, the UN adopted October 17th as the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty. It was around the same time that developing countries like India adopted liberalization and deregulation. Unlike many NGOs, CUTS supported the reforms, but understood that effective regulatory regimes were needed. It then adopted a second motto: liberalization, yes, but with safety nets. The first being value for people. Jagdish Bhagwati, noted trade economist. CUTS has developed from a modest NGO addressing mainly domestic issues to a preeminent position as an international NGO, dealing with issues relating to the world's trading system and related issues. In July 1991, CUTS participated in the 13th World Consumer Congress in Hong Kong. It was the first international exposure for CUTS. There were heated discussions on a new multilateral trade agreement, which 4 years later led to the creation of WTO. From trade policy, CUTS expanded into investment, corporate governance, and competition policy. It received huge support from the Frederick Ebert Foundation to launch work on trade policy and globalization in South Asia in 1994. This is how the South Asia Watch on Trade, Economics and Environment came into being in the next year.
The business model of SALT was widely recognized as a good example of regional network-based approach to empowering civil society organizations on the issues of globalization. This led to CUTS establishing its centers in Lusaka, Zambia in 2000 and Nairobi, Kenya in the year 2003 respectively.
The Hanoi Center came into being in 2007, followed by one in Geneva in 2008.
Establishment of CUTS International Geneva in 2008 was a turning point in CUTS history. A donor, Hewlett Foundation, approached CUTS with a grant for this purpose instead of the classical way of CUTS approaching a donor.
Furthering the cause of the right to trade, particularly of poor countries, CUTS is advocating for a Geneva consensus on the international level for fair trade, good governance and capacity building. Surendra Kanstiya, former chairman, Consumer Guidance Society of India, Mumbai. CUTS gave me the wisdom, whereas other organizations gave me knowledge and training. As its work on trade policy increased, CUTS Secretary General Pradeep Mehta was twice appointed as advisor by two WTO Director Generals, Supachai Panechpakri in 2003 and Pascal Lamy in 2012. To ensure that the fruits of liberalization reached everyone, CUTS worked for competition law and regulatory policies in India and 30 other countries in Asia and Africa. The multi-country 7-Up model was the most popular in this regard. A critical point of difference with similar projects was CUTS' approach, which was bottom-up. Gareth Thomas, former Minister of State, DFID, UK. We value the productive relationship that CUTS and Department for International Development, DFID, had built up in recent years on this agenda. An emphasis on creating local ownership and capacities was followed by comparisons with other countries. Post this, many southern governments appointed CUTS as their advisors. CUTS was also responsible for the adoption and refinement of competition law in many countries, particularly India. Besides trade and regulation, CUTS' spectrum of work includes governance. Its 20th anniversary celebrations followed the theme, Governance and its relationship with poverty reduction. The following actions led to several new initiatives, such as building capacities of smaller NGOs, using the Right to Information Act, making citizen report cards, community scorecards, and public expenditure tracking surveys. With the support of the World Bank, CUTS was appointed as the regional anchor for South Asia's Community of Practice on Social Accountability in 2012.
We celebrated our 25th anniversary in the year 2008 with a conference on Global Partnership for Development. The focus was on the Millennium Development Goal 8, which talks about global partnership for development. The Millennium Development Goals are an international challenge taken up by the international community to halve poverty by the year 2015. And in that, an enabling environment is to create a better economic environment to be able to add to the growth which is necessary to create the wherewithal to reduce poverty. While we have been working internationally as well as nationally on a very large number of issues, one of the understanding that we had, and this is something which we've been doing for a long time, is to intensify our work at the grassroots. In southern Rajasthan, for example, we have taken up promotion of livelihoods for poor women, and they are organized in about 1,000 self-help groups covering over 100,000 women. In the future, how we visualize, having completed 30 years now, we realized that we will continue to consolidate our work as well as make it more effective, and I would say cost effective as well. That is how I visualize the journey for CUTS for the next 20 years.
Our values: adhering to high standards of accountability and transparency, adoption of a centrist approach, ensuring outcomes rather than just outputs, focus on subject and geographical areas where a vacuum and need exist, enhancing capacity of various stakeholders across Asia and Africa through an inclusive approach.
So this is the opening session where we'd be setting the context, basically looking at role of innovation for sustainable development. And now may I request Mr. Pradeep Mehta to basically take over from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Abhishek. Thank you very much. Let me add to the welcome. Greetings conveyed by Abhishek to all of you. And I'm very pleased to welcome all of you to the 5th Biennial Conference. Particularly, I would like to welcome Madam Isabel Durant, the Deputy Secretary General of UNCTAD, Eduardo Perez Mota, former chairman of the Mexican Competition Authority, and Mr. Nitin Desai, former Under-Secretary General of the United Nations and President of the Governing Council of the CUTS Institute for Regulation and Competition, besides being my mentor and friend and philosopher and guide. Now, this is a flagship event. Some of you have participated in earlier editions of biennial events, which we hold regularly every 2 years, subject to financial resources. We missed the one in 2009, so otherwise the questions would have arisen, but we couldn't do that because of resource constraints. The first one was kicked off in 2007, and this was held in Delhi as an event which I think has no parallel in the civil society movement as has to deal with an important issue across the developing world, or even the developed world as such. We do have conferences which deal with many of these issues organized by international organizations like the OECD, UNCTAD, World Bank, etc. And now the what is called the International Competition Network, which is an informal network of competition authorities. So this does stand apart from the other events, and we've been fortunate to attract the best of talent and the best of resources, including the impact of these conferences have been very effective. I mean, because of the fact that we choose our themes very carefully every time, taking into account its relevance to the developing world, its currency, at the particular juncture, as well as its connection with development, regulation, and competition. The idea for this biennial series was conceived in the backdrop of developing countries' concerns of frequent regulatory failures that undermine the capacity to achieve policies important to citizens and consumers. Such failures are due to persistent and common patterns of over-regulation, under-regulation, or poorly designed regulation and implementation, as well as weak institutional capacities, coupled with very typical political economy constraints. In our first biennial, in 2007, we discussed the political economy and governance constraints that developing countries face in implementing their competition and regulatory regimes. 2 fantastic volumes of papers have been published resulting from that conference. In fact, it was a project which was supported by DFID, who have been our regular partners for 20 years in this journey on competition reforms. And what surprised me was, just for a little aside, that even there was a contribution from Belgium, because the researchers told us that Belgium is as good or as bad as any other developing country. We still are not there. Of course, things have changed now. So I just thought to mention you. So while the contest or the kind of competition was open to developing country researchers, we did accept 1 paper from Belgium. Now, during the second biennial in 2011, the chosen theme was reviewing the global experience with economic regulation, where the idea was to showcase the heterogeneity of approaches in different countries vis-à-vis the rationale for economic regulation and methodology for its evaluation, regulatory frameworks and approaches for achieving regulatory coherence. This is still a very troublesome issue. Only this afternoon I received an email from the OECD. They, as I said, they hold a global forum on competition every year, and there's one in December where I'm required to make a contribution on the regulatory coherence. Particularly, it's a major problem in many developing countries, including in India, the coherence between a sector regulator, say telecom, water, whatever, electricity, as against the competition authority when it comes to competition issues, still remains a trouble area. In the third biennial, in 2013, we deliberated upon competition reforms, emerging challenges in a globalizing world. And by that time, globalization was at its peak, unlike what the situation today is. We strongly believe that competition reform should be pursued to level the playing field and prevent interest groups and individuals from controlling the market. The fourth biennial in 2015, the one just before this, was held for the first time outside India. All the previous ones were held in Delhi. It was held in Nairobi. Its theme was competition reforms in key markets for enhancing social and economic welfare in developing countries. It is basically the outcome of a project, what we call the CREW project. It was carried out in 4 countries, Ghana, India, Philippines, Zambia, across 2 common sectors which affect the poor the most, staple food and passenger transport. I mean, any of you who are familiar with big cities, daily labor has to really, depend upon passenger transport in order to travel from home, which is far away, to the place of work. Shyam Khemani was our advisor, along with Frederick Jenny, who's unfortunately in Brasilia today. As we speak, there is a conference going on in Brasilia, the BRICS conference. The agenda in Nairobi highlighted the relevance of competition and regulatory reforms in meeting crucial social and economic welfare objectives in the countries. What was also very interesting about this project, which has impressed a very large number of people, is that we looked at both consumer welfare and producer welfare. Fine. I mean, when we talk in terms of producer welfare, we were looking at small entrepreneurs, a single bus owner operator, for example, or a farmer, for example. But it is important to look at producer welfare also as against the normal fashion of looking at only consumer welfare outcomes of good competition law. The other thing that we looked at is how does competition policy fit into the sustainable development goals? That was the theme at that particular moment. A baton which we are carrying into this biennial as well. Thus the main theme is fostering innovation for sustainable development, revisiting IPRs and competition from the lens of optimal regulation. Can be contentious, I'll come to that later. Well, the first part is the central theme. The two related sub-themes of IP competition interface and optimal regulation are crucial for a good innovation ecosystem. You can't have one without the other, and one can be difficult as well. Therefore, how do you get the other? So therefore, we are looking at optimal regulation. If you see the agenda, there is a clear design. While plenaries would be deliberating on broader issues, parallel sessions would venture into micro issues related with their sectoral implications. Parallel sessions are being held here and there. There are two other rooms here. We are also touching upon the much talked about contemporary topic of regulatory uncertainty, where we want to take away some doable action agenda. Similarly, we feel that deliberations on PPPs and innovation for sustainable development would be helpful for all of us in achieving these sustainable development goals, particularly where public sector investment is not coming to the extent possible, or the need being very large, there's a need for this. And at the same time, looking at PPPs which consider peoples first, which consider stakeholders first, particularly utilities, not PPPs, but say water or road or what have you. How do they keep the stakeholders' views in mind? Now, the theme this year is akin to Buddha's philosophy of middle path. We generally, in our political philosophy at CUTS, as you might have seen in the documentary, is to follow the middle path. We are neither left nor right. The strings of Veena should neither be too taut nor too loose to be in tune and playable. A balance has to be struck with the tension in the strings of Veena for it to be musical and rhythmical. Similarly, balance has to be struck between competition and exclusivity for innovation. A balance has to be struck between interests of incumbents and disruptors for optimal regulation. A balance has to be struck between growth and equity for development. A balance has to be struck in consumption patterns for development to be sustainable. So there are a host of issues that we need to understand, both conceptually as well as practically. India has recently adopted a national intellectual property rights policy having a vision of creative India, innovative India. This mission is to stimulate a dynamic, vibrant and balanced intellectual property rights system in India to foster creativity and innovation. A robust IP protection regime is necessary to build an innovation ecosystem. Quite often, India has been a leader in the developing world in terms of these concepts. I thought it is important for me to mention this, because at the moment there is a US-India closeness coming up, where IPR is a very contentious issue in the sense that we do not follow what the US would like us to do, the TRIPS Plus. One of the objectives of the IPR policy is to have strong and effective IPR laws which balance the interests of rights owners with larger public interest. For the achievement of this balance, IP interface with competition law and policy has also been recognized as one of the important areas for study and research. This balancing act also takes us to the Uruguay round of trade negotiations, with which Eduardo has been associated, where India played a crucial role in achieving certain flexibilities in the TRIPS agreement. These flexibilities are also some of the tools to balance the interests of rights owners with larger public interests, particularly related with public health and agriculture. If you look closely, these are basically tools to balance exclusivity. So it is not as if people, when they were crafting or debating or negotiating the TRIPS agreement, did not realize the value of these kind of flexibilities to be incorporated in the agreement itself. So which allows a balance between both the exclusivity as well as public interest. We are also advocating for a national competition policy to be adopted by the Government of India, where we again reiterate the issue of IPRs and policy as well as the protection as such. Many countries in the world, including Australia, have adopted a competition policy, which is beyond a competition law. I mean, it's basically a policy is a soft law, as against a competition act is a hard law. Will it be a competition policy imperative to implement the TRIPS flexibilities? In fact, even the competition policy we drafted had faced a lot of debate in the US. Just the draft policy, you can well imagine, because particularly we were highlighting the issue of FRAND, which is fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory access. Now, indeed, the competition policy would certainly have a pro-competition effect. That's the whole idea behind it. And today, when there are backlashes against globalization in rich countries, revisiting competition and IPRs would be a good idea. Similarly, issues and concerns due to disruptive technologies and how to regulate them is yet another conference sub-theme that I feel is in the category of urgent and important. Before intervening, governments and regulators, this is something which I was just talking to Eduardo before coming here as to how do we deal with this kind of thing, which many of us are yet to understand or to grasp the details as to how the disruptive economy which is there and how do you regulate many of these issues. Data is the big oil, as they say. How do you regulate data ownership, for example? Before intervening, governments and regulators would need to understand the finer points, including how such new technologies work, and pinpoint the cause for the genesis of identified concerns. So here again, there would be a big role for civil society to interact with the government, because it won't be an easy task. Else we may be doing more harm by disturbing the emerging ecosystem of startups in the developing world. We at CUTS have also been pushing for adoption of frameworks like regulatory impact assessment in India and other developing countries, which can aid in balancing the interests of diverse stakeholder groups and arrive at optimal design for policies and regulations. RII can greatly help the designing of new regulations for the disruptive economy. It's a kind of an approach that is taken where all stakeholders are brought on the same table in order to design a law or policy, rather than a law being designed from the top and coming into your head without understanding it. Many of you would have experienced facing a lot of problems because you end up with laws which are quite sort of nonsensical in various places. With this, I, on behalf of the CUTS family, once again welcome you all to the Pink City. We have around 70 participants from Africa, Southeast Asia, South Asia, Latin America, Europe, US, etc. It's a very large spread from across the world. We hope you will have a comfortable stay for the next 2 days with a lot of food for thought as well as intellectual satisfaction. With that, thank you very much. May I invite Eduardo?
Well, thank you very much for this kind invitation, Pradeep. It's a pleasure to be here in India in this participating in this important meeting. I think the topic that you have chosen for this conference is a crucial topic. It's an important discussion. And the question that I would like to discuss today is basically the balance. What should be the right balance between competition and the promotion of innovation? Should it be by what's the right balance between intellectual property protection and competition promotion. And I would like to divide my presentation and my reflections in basically 4 areas. First, why is it important to focus on innovation? Why innovation is so crucial at this moment? Second, what is the intersection between intellectual property rights, I mean the promotion of innovation through intellectual property and through competition, both mechanisms which look to be completely opposite are important to promote innovation. So what should be that, what is that intersection? Third, a glance of the current IPR and competition system, I mean, which is the international and the domestic way that intellectual property is protected, and what is international and the domestic mechanism to promote competition in different markets. And finally, just let me, I would like to try to give and to discuss with you some ideas on how to move forward towards that right balance between intellectual property protection and competition promotion. In the very first area, in the question of why it's so important to focus on innovation, I would like to discuss basically two basic areas in which innovation is so important. One is obviously economics. Innovation is crucial to drive productivity and to promote growth and competitiveness and investment in any country. So innovation has become one of the most important drivers of productivity, clearly. And second, the second area of importance of innovation has to do with the social impact. Obviously, an access to appropriate technologies improves living conditions. Innovation has a crucial impact on food, on the way food is produced and how food could be distributed, on medicines production and discovery and inventions, as well as information and data. In those, I mean, among many areas, those 3 areas have very important impact on the have a very important social impact of innovation. The reality is basically showing us that in the last 40 years, the number of innovations that are crucial in our marketplace has been increasing and accelerated in an accelerated way. In the last 40 years, the number of innovation cases is greater than the number of innovation cases that we have seen in the last 400 years. So this is increasing at an exponential way. The balance between intellectual property protection and market competition is a key component to promote an innovation-friendly ecosystem. Obviously, the way to promote a natural and the best innovation-friendly ecosystem, you need many elements. You need elements like stability and well-functioning of institutions. You need a country that is well endowed on educated workforce. You would need a very sound research and education infrastructure, linkages between public and private sectors, enterprises committed to research and development. Those are many elements that have to do with an innovation-friendly ecosystem. But the 2 key areas that are an important factors to make all those elements to work in a more efficient and positive way have to do on two areas. Basically, one is intellectual property protection, and the second is competition. And the quick question is precisely how we should balance these two areas in order to maximize the speed of innovation and in order to be sure that that innovation system is going to improve the living standards of the societies in those countries. So let me move to this intersection precisely between intellectual property protection and competition. As I was saying before, those are completely different approaches to promote innovation. If you look at the market structure that is promoted by intellectual property protection, you would see that is through a monopoly kind of strategy. So the fact of protecting intellectual property through patents or permits or licenses that do not allow any other company or any other operator to use during some period of time, that basically gives the payment to research and development through economic rents. There might be a question on if those are rents that affect negatively consumers or not. But that's basically a monopolistic strategy way to promote innovation. The second is competition, and competition basically looks for a completely different approach to promote innovation. The approach of competition is to open the markets, to ensure that the best way to get the benefits from research and from investment and research and development has to do basically on having a greater speed of innovation in order to win the place in the market, in order to increase your market share, in order to gain those consumers. So those are completely different approaches to promote innovation. And we see a lot of examples where that innovation benefits the poor people. For instance, innovation in the banking system, the banking system through information and technology to use the cellular phones in order to use the payments system in Africa has been a very important mechanism to basically to include and to be able to give people the possibility to use banking services in very remote areas that otherwise would not have the possibility to use the payments, an efficient payment system. If you look at music, for instance, a balance between intellectual property protection that gives platforms like Spotify that promote intellectual property on the one side, but promote competition at the same time, and give access to music to many people that otherwise would not have access in an accessible way. And you see many other platforms and data systems that promote a lot of competition and benefit a good part of the population. In the case of hotels, for instance, all those platforms of hotel travel systems that are now taken by Airbnb. As long as you keep that system, that market open to access to new operators, the innovation and the promotion and the benefits, the promotion of new players and the benefit that creates to the population is quite clear. So there is, however, an overlap between the competition world and the intellectual property protection world. And that overlap is very clear in three areas that have to do with intellectual property protection. One is the granting of intellectual property rights. The moment at which the intellectual property agencies give the possibility, the permit, the license for one license holder or patent holder to use that benefit in the next few years, the spectrum and the how wide that protection is offered has to do with competition. I mean, it is related with competition. It is also related with competition the way those licenses are used. If you tie your license, if you bundle that license with other services, that basically could erode the possibility of competition in those markets. And the third area has to do with enforcement and litigation. So the way many companies in the medicines area basically try to avoid or to increase the number of years of the use of patents, that basically keeps other operators for competing in those markets or producing generics, for instance, at that, and that damages the consumer interest. So those are clear areas where you have an interaction between competition and intellectual property protection. Let me move to just to offer a very brief glance of the current IPR and competition system internationally. If you look first at intellectual property protection, in the intellectual property protection system, there are three basic institutions. One has to do, two are international, one is the WIPO, and WIPO has 191 members today. WIPO administrates multilateral agreements like the Paris Convention, like the Berne Convention, and that's an international property protection system with all forms of intellectual property. The second has to do with the WTO, and that's the TRIPS agreement, which is a multilateral trade agreement in all forms of intellectual property protection. Basically offers minimum standards of protection and enforcement internationally, and a dispute settlement mechanism in the WTO system. Besides that, you have bilateral agreements, and you have the national intellectual property regimes. That has to do with all the intellectual property system on the one side. On the other side, you have the international competition system. Competition and trade, that should be a multilateral framework. That does not exist today. I mean, there have been some intentions to promote competition in the international trade. That comes even from the Havana Charter. There was another attempt in the WTO already in the Uruguay round initiation when the WTO was created. There was the intention to discuss competition along three other programs or areas which were called the Singapore issues. From those Singapore issues, the competition and trade was eliminated in July 2004. So there is no binding instrument in that gives you some international guidelines for competition and trade. However, there is a regional framework, free trade agreements that include competition that have to do with trade, obviously. From there, you can find a very general and very simple agreements like NAFTA, that basically are best endeavors, or you could have a very sophisticated mechanism that deal with this interaction between trade and competition, like the ones that you can see in the European Union or in the free trade agreement between Australia and New Zealand. And there are other international developments. From there, you can see OECD, UNTAD, and the international competition and network. All of them are best practices, guidelines, recommendations, capacity building, and networking. I mean, those are not binding as there are as in the case of the TRIPS agreements in the WTO. And then you have the national competition regimes. So the question is how you have this interaction from the international and the national competition regimes in intellectual property protection and competition. So there is a need for a coordinated multilateral system. Why? Because you need certainty for operators, for all players, which are consumers and producers. And second, you need to ensure that there is there is a coordination between the systems of intellectual property protection and competition, because otherwise, if there is one country that is out of the system, there will be the investment incentives to stay in that country are going to move to other countries. So let me just finish touching some elements of how to improve coordination between these two areas, and that I would divide that in those proposals and ideas for those principles of how to inject competition into the intellectual property regimes. Let me divide them in basically three areas. One, some ideas for domestic action by competition agencies. Second, some ideas for a joint action by intellectual property and competition agencies, and some ideas for international action, which is more a long-term action that promotes this coordination between competition and intellectual property protection. So let me start with that international action and some set of ideas for an international action in the medium and long term. Those ideas should cover conduct for further research, better defining what is patentable, and finally to consider the scope and the duration of patent protection, patent licenses and mark protection. In the first, there is more analysis will have to take place in the conduct of further research and conduct of further research, looking at the evidence that actually say on the correlation or causal relation between intellectual property relation, innovation, and competition. More patent, there is a question that has to be put in place, which is if more patent application and grants means more or less innovation than competition. So the question is where you get more investment in research and development through competition and intellectual property protection. And investment and analysis on that will have to take place at the international level. The second is a better definition of what is patentable. Today we have a very loose definition of that concept, and that loose definition basically puts some questions on how far companies could go in the action of defending the rights of intellectual property. And finally, you have to put in the table the question of how many years for during how many years you have to give that protection. There is a basically standard of 20 years, but there is a question if that should apply to all sectors in exactly the same, and exactly with the same mechanism. What should be the level of tariff protection, and how that should vary with intellectual property protection? How should apply that protection, how many years, and if you have to differentiate among different sectors. The second, the ideas for domestic action by competition agencies will have to do basically with advocacy. Here, you don't have an issue of cartels. The problem is, it could be a problem of abuse of dominance of intellectual property protection and intellectual property rights. And the question is how those, at the domestic level, how those competition agencies should act in order to reduce the possibility, how to raise the awareness of on the importance of intellectual property rights that do not unjustifiably harm competition. And there is an important room to offer opinions from competition agencies to intellectual property protection agencies. And finally, some ideas for joint action by intellectual property protection and competition agencies. Today, those two agencies, intellectual property protection and competition agencies, work in a completely separated approach. The question here is how they coordinate their actions and their activities. There are some people have put in place some proposals that basically say that they should be the same agency. In the same agency, like in the case of Peru, you should have both agencies working together. I think that's very uncommon, but a question should be open if that should be the best way to deal with intellectual property coordination and competition. If that could not be done, opinions and coordination and exchange of information among these two agencies should take place. And the question is how that could be done. Advocacy and opinions of competition authorities could take place in the three different levels that I just mentioned before, which is in the way you grant those that protection, the way that protection is enforced, and the way that protection of intellectual property is used. And you can have opinions, and you can have recommendations and guidelines from competition agencies. Guidelines have been produced by different authorities already in Europe, in the US, in Japan, for instance. There are already guidelines of competition that could be used by intellectual property protection agencies. So the most important question today is how you are going to apply competition enforcement in especially data markets. How those markets should be considered, analyzed by competition agencies. That's an open question, and I think the best way to deal with that should be in international organizations. I would suggest to start doing that in the OECD, UNCTAD, and the ICN all together. I mean, basically to promote guidelines and general documents that could be applied by competition agencies in different parts of the world, and how they could be used by intellectual property protection agencies. I would like to thank you for this invitation, and I would like to congratulate CUTS International for taking and organizing a meeting to discuss these important issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. Can you hear me? Yeah, no, I just wanted to check whether the mic works or not. Thank you very much, Eduardo, for that tour de force. I just reminded me of that's good. Just reminded me of a reference that I heard is if algorithms, which is now the way how business is conducted, collude with another company's algorithm, how will the law treat it? You could well imagine the kind of. May I invite Isabel?
Well, Mr. Secretary General of CUTS, thank you for your invitation. It's the first time for me with CUTS International, but I know that UNCTAD, of course, worked a lot since a long period with CUTS. And maybe if I'm not completely familiar with those questions, you have to know that in the first part of my career, before to be a politician, I was an activist in the civil society, and that you never forget. I keep that in mind and in my heart, and also in my political career, and today in UNCTAD, it's for me very important to work with and for civil society, sustainable development, etc. So I'm very happy to be here on this important issue. And I was also in charge as Minister of Transport in Belgium at this period. It was in the year 2000 on all the liberalization of railways companies, railways, telecom, energy. And of course it was difficult as minister when you have to implement European law, because it was a European decision and a European law to liberalize a monopolistic sector. Of course, I understood very concretely which had a resistance with the trade unions, with the consumers, with all the stakeholders of this question. So my experience is more a concrete experience as an intellectual experience. But I think that it was railways and energy. Well, it's really, if I compare with new technology, digitalization, etc., they are really simple sector, if I can say. It's really a monopoly that you want to break, and how do you guarantee the possibility for new players to go inside? It's really, if I can say, simple. Of course, new digital technology hold enormous promise to improve the lives of people everywhere, more than only railways or energy. But without effective governance, those technologies can also pose significant social and societal risks, for example, to privacy, competition, and indeed innovation itself. So it was really good explained by Mr. Mota. Striking a policy balance between fostering entrepreneurial innovation and harnessing technology for the public good represents an enormous challenge in developing and developed countries alike. Looking at examples of driving innovation sectors around the world, we see the importance of an integrated, forward-thinking policy approach which anticipates both the market's needs as well as the incentives that steer activities toward beneficial societal outcomes. And this policy approach must ultimately reinforce a well-functioning innovation system which, first of all, serves to create and diffuse knowledge, technologies, and innovation among all stakeholders, and is typically embedded in a large city or industrial area. The obvious example is Silicon Valley in California. Many countries have tried to copy the Silicon Valley model, but few have succeeded, as simple cut and paste solution ignore a country or region's specific context, including its industrial technology development, production structure, but also the culture and the history. And it's absolutely the same in Silicon Valley, in India, in Europe, or everywhere. In the case of developing countries, particularly LDCs, an innovation system must also respond to the additional challenges they face, such as weak capabilities, many small firms that invest little in technology and innovation, that's a reality, the prevalence of the informal sector, that's maybe the rule in the LDC countries, difficulties with access to finance, weak infrastructure such as inadequate electricity. In some country you have cutting of electricity 3 or 4 hours per day. How could you develop new technology in this in such a situation? And also ineffective policy frameworks. That's the characteristic, or the biggest characteristics of those countries. We have to take that into account. UNCTAD works with developing countries on science, technology and innovation to help overcome these challenges. At the policy level, we tend to assist them in coordinating the interrelated areas of competition, intellectual property and innovation. And in principle, fostering competition encourages innovation. You explained that very well, the relationship between the two. In parallel, many countries seek to create incentives for innovation by protecting innovators' intellectual property rights, ensuring a stable environment for private investment in research, development and innovation. However, there are many examples of protection going too far and serving to block innovation or the diffusion of new technologies, depriving the wider public of their benefits. And UNCTAD has long argued that intellectual property should be a tool for development, not an end in itself, and therefore that competition and innovation policy should align on this principle. There is major disagreement on where that balance should be placed. Some argue that intellectual property rights are too strong and work against the public good. Others argue that intellectual property must be treated industry by industry. In pharmaceuticals, for example, protection is critical to reward large research and development spending needed to develop a new drug. You explained that very well. Meanwhile, in other industries, the role of intellectual property protection in rewarding innovation may be less important. A third argument is for intellectual property systems that are adapted to a country's level of development. Despite this divergent proposal on how to account for countries' different contexts, the current approach is to have a single global standard that applies to all countries and industries. At a minimum, UNCTAD believes that there should continue to be special and differential treatment for LDCs, which often lack the means to assert their priorities in the intellectual property debate. So I hope that this debate and those 2 days of debate in this conference advance the consensus on what other nuanced approach could respond to countries' different contexts, as well as mitigating risk associated with new technology, all to ensure that, of course, the benefits of technology have the broadest impact on the people's lives. So I hope that we will work on that tomorrow and after tomorrow, and that the consensus will be a little bit better, or maybe with more understandable question for everybody in order to work on the different place where we are to go further on this issue. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Madam. And that was indeed reminded of us of several priorities that the developing world has in terms of particularly public goods. Nitin?
First, let me begin by thanking CUTS and Pradeep for organizing this conference. I think the theme is a crucial one, and by the time I finish speaking, you'll realize why I think it's so crucial. Let me begin first with an obvious statement. A patent is a government-granted monopoly. And in fact, one of my problems is the use of the word intellectual property rights. Is part of the attempt to shape the narrative. Why don't we call it intellectual property monopolies? Because that's what they are. And we should call it intellectual property monopolies. And I'm sure we can ask a question as to what are the circumstances under which the conferment of such monopoly rights is justifiable. and desirable from a social point of view. Let me give you an analogy. Suppose you had an entrepreneur who developed a market for a product, and that entrepreneur spent a lot of money in developing that market for a product. I remember as a child, for instance, when Coca-Cola came to India, they spent a fortune in developing a market for aerated coals. In my school, we used to get cases and cases of free Coca-Cola. And this lasted for a long time. So they spent a lot of time, lot of effort, and a lot of money in developing this market. Now suppose they turn around. So look at the money I've spent in developing this market. Give me a monopoly so that another cola manufacturer cannot come here. Would we have accepted it? Of course not. Because we would not have seen any justification for protecting that. That was a commercial decision they made. They thought they would make profit in the long run. That's a commercial decision they made. That's fine. That's up to them. But there's no reason why I have to prevent somebody else from profiting, if you like, from the market that these people have developed. And we'll surely do this. Why do we accept this in the case of intellectual property? And that's the question that one should pose. The standard argument is that we do this because it will promote innovation and productivity growth. Good. Show me a study which establishes this. You can't measure innovation in terms of number of patents. The impact has to be measured in terms of what it actually does in terms of productivity growth. I've looked at a lot of survey reports of studies, and there's virtually no study which successfully demonstrates that intellectual property protection actually leads to productivity growth. A spectacular example that is often quoted in the literature on this, the economic literature on this, not the legal literature, the economic literature on this, is the case of the United States. For the past 3 decades, the United States has significantly strengthened its regime of protecting intellectual property monopolies. They've done lots of things, both through legislation as well as through judge-made law in order to strengthen this. For 30 years, people have examined the record of the impact, and there is no evidence that it had any impact on productivity growth or even on R&D spending. Everything continued more or less as the past. Only thing is, stuff got patented which could not have been patented before that time. This is the most spectacular example of something which shows that it actually does make a difference if you strengthened intellectual property law. If today the US law went back to its 1970 status, you would say that it shouldn't have an impact. But they've done a lot of strengthening of the law, and I'll come to that, the sort of things they've done strengthening them. See, if you really go back, the big breakthroughs in innovation have come from competition, not from protection. If you look at cars, if you look at the internet itself, the key technologies of the internet are not patented. And it's precisely because they're not patented, it has become has such a huge impact. Because it allowed innovation at the edges. Because it was not patented. That has not been patented. Cars, if you look at it, that has not been, they were not patented. You can look at other areas. Investment banking. Now suppose you're allowed an investment banker who designed a particular structured product to say you can patent that product. You think you would have had the sort of growth in capital markets that you have had? Somebody developed a convertible bond in India, for instance, 30, 35 years ago. And suppose you had allowed that person to copyright it or get a patent for it or get a monopoly for it. Would that have helped? Of course not. The reality is the big breakthroughs have come from something else, from competition, and to a certain extent the drive, the creative drive of the researcher, the producer. This certainly happened in the 19th century to a great deal. Take the example of seeds. Today, it's a big industry. There's a lot of talk about patenting, not just patenting of the seed, but patenting of components of the gene of the seed is also permitted. But the big breakthroughs came without patent protection. Hybrid maize, hybrid wheat, improved rice. The real breakthroughs in modern agriculture have not come, say, after the patenting. What the patenting is being used for stuff which will make tomatoes more red, not for the big breakthroughs. Show me where patenting has led to big breakthroughs. It's certainly true in the case of pharmaceuticals also. You know, the minor improvements in known drugs, the big breakthroughs like antibiotics, did not come through patenting. Penicillin was not patented. You know? And that's a big breakthrough. And the idea of antibiotics is born. So I'd say that the reality is that if my interest is in innovation, then it's not at all clear that protecting intellectual property monopolies is the route to follow. I'll come at the very end to what I think can be done, because innovation promotion is important, has to be done, it's a key part, and will become an increasingly more important part of the economy as it evolves. One defense sometimes people give is, oh, it's nothing to do with impact. Here is a person who may have put in an effort, and that person is entitled to the fruits of that effort. And the example given is of copyright. Author writes a book, and you give the author a copyright, on the argument that after all, it's his creative product, he should be entitled to earn something from it. But you don't stop others from writing novels. And you have some standard on what you can copyright. You won't allow somebody to copyright a word, a neologism. I invent a word, a neologism, can I go and patent it? In the United States, you're coming close to that. You're coming close to a point where you'll allow even something like this to happen. And in the case of technology, this is happening. Bits and pieces are allowed to be patented. And so what you get there is multiple patents for linked patents for a product. A best example of this is our mobile phone. The number of patents, the number of people to whom royalties have to be paid for this mobile phone is very large. And what this does is, it basically constrains innovation downstream. Because the people who own the patents are not interested in promoting. In any case, it's so complex. You may do something, you don't know whose patent you may be violating. I don't know how many of you follow this, but you see the sheer number of cases of patent violation in the smartphone business that you get in the press. Just go and look. Just do a little Google search of these things. There's other things that are happening. People are opening up what one could describe as obvious things, general knowledge which is widely available for patenting. You have had, we know of the case of turmeric and neem in the United States, the attempt to try and patent that. So fortunately, we could do something about it and stop it. But still, don't be surprised if some minor modification of turmeric is patented, or some way of doing something to the turmeric, maybe adding vitamin to it or something, will be patented. So very obvious things are being patented. You have a case, Amazon has a patent for one click, that I can order and pay for what I'm buying with one click. It was given a patent. Anybody else who uses a one-click option on an e-marketing site will have to pay them royalty. Microsoft's own phone was a failure. But for every phone, an Android phone, they collect a royalty because there's some small thing. It's a thing for scheduling meetings, which is hardly ever used. But because it's there, there's a capability in the phone, you have to pay them a royalty. And they collect royalty from everybody. Motorola actually tried to challenge this and lost the case. Lost the case where? They lost it in the US Trade Commission. And that's understandable because on the trade side the US has been has pushed for intellectual property issues very strongly. So the other thing that you see more and more now in the West, and more particularly in the United States, which is of course the great Valhalla for those who believe in intellectual property issues, monopolies. And what you're seeing is that patent protection is becoming an instrument of corporate warfare. You take Apple, Google, and Microsoft. They are using patents simply to get at each other. Google, which is a latecomer to this game, didn't have enough. So they bought up Motorola. And their purpose is not to use Motorola's knowledge. Their purpose is to use Motorola's patents to stop the other guys doing things. And frankly, the whole system is becoming a tool not for promoting innovation, but from constraining it increasingly. There is very little evidence that the strengthenings that we have seen in patent law have had a beneficial effect in terms of innovation. I'm not even gone into the issue of social impact, etc. We all felt for a long time that, for instance, in pharmaceutical research, work that needs to be done on diseases which affect large numbers of people in the world is not being done. But I've not even gone into that. I'm saying even within its own framework of reference, there's very little evidence that this has led to genuine innovation, productivity growth. Yes, number of patents have gone up, but that's no measure. I mean, just looking at the number of patents does not constitute a measure of innovation. It has to be impact on the economy in terms of productivity. Or has it changed incentives? Then why has it not led to increases in R&D? Why is it that big increases in R&D have come in countries which don't have this? So what do we do then? What do we go? Where do we go? My argument so far would lead to the proposition that you're best off by abolishing all patent law. But that won't work. You know, about 60 years ago, an economist, Fritz Bachlob, was testifying in the US Congress. And that's what he said there was, if you do not have a patent law, it will be highly irresponsible to suggest that you have one. But if you have a patent law, it would be equally irresponsible to say you get rid of it. So what we have to look for is modifying the sort of rigorous regime that has emerged over the past 30 years into something which is much more consistent with what I think is a core requirement, allowing competition to drive innovation. In fact, so my basic thesis is, it is not a question of balancing these two. You must make intellectual property issues subordinate to competition. That the primary goal must be competition, and we do intellectual property only in cases where you can justify it in some form. For instance, you know, there are high initial costs, it's something, we could specify criteria. So what are the types of things we can do? First, we have to stop this escalation of protection. You're talking in terms of, the US already has protection for trade secrets. They're now talking in terms of allowing secret patents. That is, patents where no disclosure is required. I cannot think of anything more illogical than that. But there is talk of that. So this has to stop. This is nothing but a type of colonialism, if you like. But there are other smaller changes which are possible. We need to go back to the earlier regime of shorter periods, defined periods for the protection, the stricter controls on evergreening. We are lucky. We have law courts which have taken a fairly tough stand on evergreening, particularly on pharmaceuticals, but not everywhere. But there must be stronger rules on preventing evergreening. A tiny change and say this is a new product. The newness criterion must be applied rigorously, if at all you're going to do it. Process versus product controls. You know, the greatest innovations in chemical engineering came in Germany in the 19th century, when they had process protection, but not product protection. Some of the greatest gains we made in pharmaceuticals were from that period, when we had process protection, but not product protection. So let's rethink what we need to do there in these areas. A lot of this research is based on stuff which has come out of publicly funded money. Your money, my money. Now, if that research is a product of money which you and I have paid, why should we not have a right to use that research? So there are people, there are countries which argue that if this is a product of publicly funded research, it will not be patented. These are basically defensive measures. In terms of positive measures, which would help in innovation, now one of the questions which is always raised is a high cost, particularly in the case of pharmaceuticals, that we incur huge costs in developing this molecule, testing it, field trials, etc. About 70 to 80% of the cost of pharmaceutical innovation is stage 3 clinical trials. There's a strong case for removing these from the regime of corporates to the government. Because what you're doing here is testing the efficacy and safety of something that the scientists have developed. And I think there's a strong case for making it independent and funded by the government, because it is a public service. You're testing a drug for its efficacy and its safety. Ultimately, it's your pharmaceutical administration which will have to implement it. So I would say that that will bring down costs dramatically. Put it forward. Show me any pharmaceutical company which will support you. Why? You're telling them, no, you don't have to incur the cost, we'll incur the cost. But they'll stop, they don't like that idea. But I see, as an economist, I think this makes a lot of sense to have the government, and there are other areas of cost which the government can do. Second, the government can support groundbreaking research, not routine stuff. If you look at the United States itself, DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, they were the people who supported the internet. They were the people who supported GPS. None of that was patented. But it happened because there was public funding for it. So government funding for foundational research, not just research in universities, but the sort of stuff which, say, DARPA used to do. That should certainly be done. So that you say, okay, I'm reducing your costs. You don't have to do that fundamental research. We will do it and make it available on a free basis. Collaborations on an open source basis. We did this in India for tuberculosis, where pharmaceutical companies were brought together. They jointly did research on the bacteria. But after that, it was up to them to develop a molecule. So the basic research, which would get them to the point at which they can develop the molecule, was shared. It was open source. Everybody had access to it. all those who are participating. So there are other models like this, other areas where the open source system can be followed. Fiscal breaks, that also is possible. And the great advantage of this is we can use the system, the public system, to really push incentives to encourage innovation in areas of social impact. No? The government can certainly say, and I'm going to certainly give heavy support to somebody who's doing tuberculosis work, but we will not do clinical trials for a fairness cream. You know? So I would say that there are things that there are positive benefits of shifting the focus of the expensive parts of innovation to the government. And then the case for protection, because we spent money, disappears. It has to be defended only on the grounds that it will deliver benefits which otherwise would not be available. And I suspect we will find in many of those cases that competition is a better answer than protection. Why have we reached this point? We've reached this point because we allowed the narrative to be taken over. We've allowed the narrative to be taken over by older companies, older countries, which are past their prime. And they are the ones, and the very fact that you use the word intellectual property rights. Why don't you call it what it is? But they will not do that. And then there's a general tendency to say that anybody who does not follow that set of standards is somehow a thief. You know? The real thieves are those guys. No? Not the innovators who are outside. It is in the interest of startups, new technology entrepreneurs, new countries, countries which are emerging on the global R&D scene to challenge this. And that to me is the real issue. The real issue is to change the narrative. And it's for this reason I say that in the context of our meeting, competition is primary. Intellectual property protection has to serve that purpose. There's no question of a balance. This is basically the message that I want to get to you. I hope you are convinced, but otherwise, let us see what comes from it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nitin, for presenting some factual views, I would say. Of course, I mean, there are always facts which always conflict with another set of facts. Having said that, there is the Minister Suresh Prabhu, who's our Minister for Trade and Industry, was to come. Unfortunately, he had to cancel his trip at the last moment. What he did was to send a videotape of his speech for the conference, and I'm a bit embarrassed to show you the same because he ends up only praising me rather than to talk about the issues. But then we've had some very excellent presentations. So if it is all right, can you play that tape? It's about 5 minutes.
CUTS is organizing an event in Delhi, in Jaipur, which I wanted to attend, but unfortunately I had to be in Mumbai because the King of Belgium is here. But otherwise I have a lot of respect for Pradeep Mehta. He has been doing single-handedly a work of shaping public opinion to work on issues related to trade. This is a very important biennial conference on competition, regulation and development, which I wish I could attend. But I can assure you one thing, that Pradeep Mehta ji, whatever he thinks and whatever he does is also in public interest. So we'll offer him all my support and make sure that whatever ideas are generated here, I'll take them to the logical conclusion. So thank you very much and congratulations to Pradeep Mehta, who has been really, I must say, like a missionary. He's working on changing the vision and the ideas and the thought process of the country to make it more open to the new ideas which are necessary to promote trade in India. Thank you very much.
Let me thank Shri Suresh Prabhu in absentia. And I felt a bit guilty if I had not shown the videotape. And anyway, I had no time for me to correct what he had said in the context of. But the important part is he's one of our very popular ministers who can take forward our messages into the government very quickly. And therefore, I didn't want him to hear that his tape was not played. Having said that, we have about 10 minutes, and if anybody would like to raise any questions, please, Rajan. And please do identify yourself. Team, can we have the mics? Yeah. No, hey.
Rajan Matthews from COAI. We represent mobile industry and the affiliated ecosystem. But question from Mr. Desai. Very provocative point of view, but why don't we abolish in the same tone private property rights? After all, these early rentals, right? After all, IP has property as its middle component. And why don't we allow competitive pressures and dynamics to drive the real estate market, for example?
Yeah, good question. Can we take more questions? Yeah. Any more questions? Thought we'll take a clutch of questions and then ask the panel to respond. Hello? Alan. I know who you are, but...
Yes, Alan Asher, the chair of the Foundation for Effective Markets and Governance, a body that's very concerned about welfare outcomes and not doctrines. And so it's a question that any panelist who wishes might want to respond to. And it perhaps picks up a little bit from Mr. Desai's comments about how we should rename IP rights as monopolies. I'm not proposing that, but I would say, as many competition regimes, the one that I represented in Australia for many years, there is a possibility to have conduct which is otherwise in breach of competition laws authorised where there is a public process and it can be established that there is a public benefit that outweighs an anti-competitive detriment. And my question is there some scope for us to start rethinking IP not as a tradable right, but as a conditional right, subject to establishing a public benefit in that right?
Thank you. Ankit here.
This is Sridhar from IIIT Bangalore. This is a question to Mr. Desai. So we have something in between monopoly patented rights regime and non-patented competition regime in the form of SEPs, standard essential patents, which have been promoted by SDOs. So do you think that any tweaking is required in order to sort of make it effective? In some cases, for example, in internet technologies, this has proven to be socially beneficial, and there are some cases where the patent owners of the SEPs do not adhere to the conditions of the FRAND. But are there any tweaking which is needed instead of totally depending on public spending on intellectual property rights?
Thank you. We can have one more question before I turn to the panel. Yeah, Mahesh.
Well, I think it's...
Mahesh Uppal.
Yes, sorry, my apologies. Mahesh Uppal, I'm a telecoms consultant. I guess it's Dr. Desai's lecture which seems to have evoked a fair amount of comment. But my point, again, in response is this, that you've spoken about the role of, for example, governments, etc., in especially in mitigating the harmful impacts or harmful effects of IPR and how it's being enforced, etc. But my real concern there is that given the steady deterioration in the quality of government institutions or public institutions, aren't you not, by suggesting something like this, actually risking distorting markets even more than some of these things are already doing? So I think that's my question. Yeah.
Thank you. Nitin?
Let me take up the first question. It's not an analogy would be if I were to give one property developer a monopoly right and prevent others from entering that. And I go to or if I have a piece of government land. And so in a sense, the issue that we have to address is it's the use of the word property which is leading to the confusion. Yeah. That's why I use the word intellectual property monopolies rather than intellectual property rights, because it's a deliberate attempt at creating a false analogy with the right of private property. You know? So this is the important thing. And incidentally, from an economic point of view, knowledge is qualitatively different.
Can you take this mic?
Fine.
This is better.
Knowledge is quality. On the second question, I think that's a very valid way of looking at the, if you like, the departures from competition. In fact, I would go a stage further. I would even go in for something like a request for proposals in a certain sense. I'd say, I need this, say for environment, I need a technology which will do this. I'm ready to give you, exclusive rights. And I would ask for a request for proposals, saying, let 20 guys propose and we will choose. And yes, because of the purpose it is serving, you will have that. There are certain other areas where I can imagine a justifiable departure from just open, free entry. One of the areas that strikes me is long-term defense needs. Long-term defense needs. It's very difficult in the case of when you're developing an aircraft which is likely to be coming to use, say, in 2030 or 2040, and people have to make investments now for that. Now, it's very difficult to have an absolutely free-for-all there. So there are areas, I'm not saying there would not be, but these are, as you correctly pointed out, these are areas where we see a clear social benefit from giving a certain right of exclusivity to somebody. This is my point, that basically treat competition as the norm. And if you want departures, then justify them from the perspective of social impact or social need, or maybe strategic.
Or even economic need.
Or strategic needs, it may be even, like for instance, you don't want 20 people competing in the global oil market. Okay, but there are, and where you do it, keep it open at the licensing stage. Say, all right, we have this need, we'll ask for requests for proposals, and then judge in terms of what people offer. I think your point about the quality of public administration is a serious concern, and we would not wish something like this to end up with a sort of crony. And so, behind what I would say is that along with this, funding basic research is not a big issue. I think it has to be done by scientists and technologies themselves. I hope no minister gets involved in deciding, where to deploy money for basic research. And in most countries, this is the way it is done. DARPANET nobody interfered with DARPANET. It was left to itself. DARPANET is the original internet. So DARPA was left to itself and it did that. So I'd say that, yes, I accept your qualification, but I think one may have to be maybe more guarded in this type of public support. But let's go back for a minute to the example of stage 3 clinical trials. Now there it was not a question of supporting that person versus that. It's simply a rule saying no, stage 3 clinical trials are not your job. It is our job as a government. We will do the trials and determine the efficacy and safety of the molecules you're proposing. End of story. And that, of course, will reduce the cost enormously. But so the cost justification disappears. So I would argue, yes, let's be more careful. Don't just do a uniform thing. Fiscal breaks are already there. We have very generous fiscal breaks in this country. So I'd say, yes, it's possible to abuse the system, but not if we are more careful. And I would say, so I feel it can be done. The main thing is change the narrative. Competition matters. Departures from competition have to be justified.
I think on that note, Eduardo.
Yes, I would like to basically go over the second question, because I like the approach, and I think I do not depart very much of what you say, even that I do not completely coincide. But let me just use this example. I think the general principle, I agree that the general principle should be that intellectual property protection should be based in terms, or should be given in terms of public interest. And the fact is how you can make that protection contestable. And let me just give an example that I think you know very well, Pradeep, even though that we did not know each other at that time. But let me take the example of the start of the Doha round in the WTO. One condition to start the round, put by many developing countries, especially African countries, was how to flexibilize the TRIPS agreement in order to deal with important health issues that were basically of the interest of not only African countries, but at that moment that it was put forward by Africans, many Latin American countries, and some Asian countries as well. But the basic homologous or the basic rule was this was put forward by poor countries. Poor countries that could not offer mandatory licenses to domestic laboratories because they didn't have those laboratories. So even if you had the situation in TRIPS where under some special emergency considerations, health problems, social problems, social problems, you could give mandatory licenses. I mean, you don't have to apply the 20 years of patent protection and so on in those cases. The problem is that in those countries, you didn't have even laboratories that could produce those medicines. And the TRIPS rules did not allow some other countries. India was a case, Brazil was another case, countries that were very efficient producers of generics, but they could not export those generics, or they could not use those mandatory licenses to export those generics to those countries. And the problem was precisely, I mean, it was AIDS, tuberculosis, well, we call it dengue in Latin America, but it's malaria. So how to deal with that problem? So the instruction of the ministers to start the Doha round was to make that agreement, I mean, to change the TRIPS agreement in order to deal with those issues. And I had the chance precisely to chair that discussion. It took us a year of a discussion, and at the end of that year, I remember the U.S. did not sign, and that was the only country. We were at that time in the WTO, there were, I think, 140 countries, but the only country that didn't sign was the U.S., and it had to be consensus based. Few months after, the U.S. finally agreed to sign, and it was basically the same document. But the point that I want to make here is that flexibilization of TRIPS what it gave was to make the market contestable. Some people say today that has not worked because not many mandatory licenses have been given. But that's not the point. The point is, if access to those medicines is better today than it was before, if the prices of those medicines is lower because there is a contestability, I mean, there is a contestable market because those producers of patented goods or patented medicines have the possibility to face competition, that will oblige them to offer better prices and to offer better conditions to access of those medicines. So I think that's an example precisely that goes in the line that you are suggesting, and that I think you are suggesting as well, Mr. Desai, is how to make those that protection contestable in such a way that public interest is basically considered.
Thank you. Andrew?
Thank you. So thank you for this, the question, and you a little bit provocative speech, because I think that it obliges us also to go further and to explain which is our point of view. So I'm not sure that you have to reverse or inverse the burden of the proof. So you say first competition, and then probably, or in certain extent, possibility to. I'm not sure that it's necessarily the good way. I like what you said about the medicine and the Doha round, etc. It means that to explain that we have very, very different situations, especially in the LDC, but even in the cultural and the political approach in our countries. In some countries, well, I am a European, even I'm working for UN, my cultural approach is a European approach, is very different, of course, as a USA approach. What about competition, role of the market, etc. So we cannot avoid to discuss that also, because in order to have good laws or a good implementation of the laws, it has to be acceptable or in accordance with the cultural and the political approach. Are our government the best government? I'm not sure. It depends. Sometimes yes, sometimes not. But of course we need, so nobody in the room will contest the necessity to have public authorities, elected public authorities. We like or we don't like, that's another question. We can change if we don't like it, but that's normal that a government is in the position to take the rules or to apply the rules or the international rules when they exist. In some cases they doesn't exist, so you have to do that on national level. So I think that it's a little bit difficult to start with competition as a goal as such. I think that we have to have conditionality, specific situation, medicine, health, or I think that, what about environment? You have many problems on environment question, and if you want to achieve SDG or climate agreement from Paris, maybe you would have to have not more competition but more protection in order to protect some sectors from global competition and to protect them, because we need to protect them. What about the achievement of this Paris Agreement? So that's my first reflection. My second question, and it's also what about the WTO? When there is a problem, a claim of a dispute, I think that it's important, of course, that the dispute settlement could be, and it's the case in the WTO. I think that the system is a very good system because you put in the dispute settlement a third countries in order to train him, etc. So I think that it's important to know who will at the end arbitrate the arbitration. Do we need a global arbitration court worldwide? Maybe yes, it could be useful. Of course, it's not easy to build such a court, but I think that it's important. We had a big discussion in Europe with the CETA, the agreement between European Union and Canada, and the TTIP with the USA. That's a big discussion. Who is able in a bilateral agreement to organize arbitration? It's a private sector. If it is a private sector, I'm not sure that it's really completely confident for the actors. It's the public sector, it's the law as such. Yes, I think that it could be better as it is a court with judge and with the rules of the rule of law. Well, that's all those questions behind the two questions of the room.
Thank you very much. The problem is, or I would say the situation is, it's a power game. It's mercantilism versus equity. So you constantly find these kind of problems. Now the exception that was achieved at the Doha was the declaration which Eduardo forgot to mention, the declaration on TRIPS and public health. That was pushed by the civil society, madam. Incidentally, it was not governments who pushed it. So it is not as if the world is sleeping on many of these issues. The problem is that public health is an issue which is an emotional issue. So you can, it is palpable. But when you are looking at a very large number of issues which are not palpable, you do not know what goes into your phone, etc., and there are thousands of patents in one phone instrument and so on. How does it impact innovation? How does it impact the consumer? It probably is something which you may not know. And there I think the point which Nitin made was that putting competition ahead is important. And as far as the market is behaving in a proper manner, there is no barriers to entry. Today in India we can buy about 100 phone instruments in spite of all the patented technologies which go into that. And we still are able to get it cheap. I mean, from this phone instrument you can buy from 5,000 rupees to an i10 which goes to 10 lakh rupees or 1 million rupees, and a very funny kind of situation. What I'm only trying to say is that yes, competition is important, and here is an example that you need a large number of players in the market. You can remunerate the innovator. Surely innovation is important, and particularly, as I said, in issues which are not palpable to an ordinary consumer, you may not react in the same way as you would in the case of AIDS drug. And Eduardo, to complete your point, what came out later on because of this public health, that countries which cannot produce the AIDS drug because they don't have that kind of market can import it from India and Brazil and these countries, and that did happen as a consequence of that particular deal, which was the declaration, which was the only good deal which happened in Doha, and the rest of it, there were two other agreements at Doha, and the other one never, the implementation agreement didn't go anywhere at all, and the development agenda is still looking for development. Sure.
No, I was actually going to argue that from the environmental perspective, you may well end up in a situation where down the line you'll have to make an environmental exception as you did for pharmaceutical. And let me give you a very concrete example, HFC abolition.
Yeah.
One of the reasons it is dragging around is because the only way you can do it is buying patented technology from DuPont. Now,
that's a very dirty story. I don't want, otherwise.
But I wanted to stress.
I've written extensively on it.
Yeah, and so that is a case where you could argue that basically the intellectual property regime is standing in the way of a more rapid use of environmentally sound technology.
Nitin, this is a classic example of the power game that I was talking about.
Yes.
Mercantilism versus equity. DuPont could, purchase everybody possible.
Protection is a form of mercantilism.
Otherwise, we'll go on forever. So, the fact remains that it is a power game. Let us be very clear about that. And how we are able to deal with it is something like TRIPS and public health declaration at Doha was a good sign. With that, may I request Uday to please propose a vote of thanks.